Okay, so we are ready to start. I'm the only one that is really stuck here because I cannot really move. So anyway, the idea of this first session is to go through the new maps with you and to explain to you what we did, how we did it, what are the principles around the new maps, and also I would like this workshop to be quite interactive. So if you have questions, if you have any remarks, please feel free to raise your hand and just ask us about it, because it's not a lecture. It's about sharing experiences. I see that many of you are familiar with the maps already. You probably read the new maps as well. So we would like really to get your views on it. And if you have any question or any doubt, just let us know. So what is the new maps? The new maps, it's an ambitious universal tool. That is something that you need to retain. It's something that we design for all countries. And it intends to evaluate the way the public procurement system works. So it's similar to other, let's say, international tools and standards that were developed recently in the past few years, like, for instance, the PIFA. I don't know if you know the PIFA assessment for public finance management. Any of you knows the PIFA? Well, okay. So it's a standard tool for evaluating public finance management, and it includes, for instance, one reference to procurement in there, but it's more general. It's not related to procurement. And for instance, another tool like that is the TADAT, which is intended to be used for tax purposes and fiscal systems. See? Sorry. Oh. Okay. No, todavía no, pero... Yeah, I need some time to... Anyway. So it's something similar to these kind of international standards, but it's not a new tool. So the maps already existed. So what we did, we revised the previous maps. We conducted the revision process of the maps since April 2015. It was decided in a meeting in Manila in the Philippines to revise the previous maps. The previous maps was targeting mainly developing countries. So it was a tool that was developed at the time in 2004 by the OECD and the World Bank to be used in developing countries. And in the recent past, the public procurement systems and the principles and the international standards around procurement evolved a lot. So the international community decided to revise the maps and adapt it to the most recent trends and evolutions. So that is something that this group carried out since 2015. And we are linking this revision process of the maps to these international standards in public procurement. I'm talking, for instance, about the European Union directives on procurement. I'm talking about the ancestral model law. I'm talking about the GPA, the Government Procurement Agreement of the WTO. I'm talking about the procurement frameworks of the multi-development banks. So we did a lot of analysis around these international standards. We collected a lot of information, and we designed the new maps, and we upgraded the previous one based on these international standards, also with an eye on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So that is something that I believe it's very important for the new maps. One of you mentioned previously this linkage with sustainability. In fact, it's cross-cutting in the maps, and we even designed a module for sustainable procurement. So we have specific indicators in the maps that are targeting this linkage with the SDGs, as we call them. mainly the SDG 12.7 and the 16.6 that are related to procurement. So the new maps is totally aligned with the SDGs, and if you apply the new maps, it's possible also to see how the country is moving in the procurement area related to the SDGs. It's a huge concern of the OECD, the Sustainable Development Goals and this agenda for 2030. So it's important to recognize the maps as a tool to achieve the SDGs as well. No, it's not working. Okay, so we upgraded the maps for universal use, and it was a very interesting process because it was, let's say, a collaborative effort by over 25 entities and institutions and countries. And it was very rewarding for us to see this kind of commitment to revise the maps. And that's why we believe so much in the maps, because it was a collective effort. It came from all of you, and some of you in this room participated. Many of you contributed, as some of you already said before. So we have, for instance, countries. We have multilateral development banks. We have international organizations, and we have countries that are planning to use the maps also as part of this stakeholder group. Basically, we have also donors and the agencies that were in the previous maps that were also part of this exercise. I'm not going to bother you with the names. You can find them in the website, but almost all development banks were part of this revision process. We had the most relevant agencies that are doing some development aid also around this exercise. And the exercise was coordinated by the OECD. So the reason for that is that the OECD, as let's say an independent broker, more let's say far away from the financing, could bring this also more developed perspective, because as you know, the OECD members are considered the most developed countries in the world. And we have been working on procurement for a long time, and we have a lot of guidance on procurement. We also have a recommendation on public procurement, which was also one of the things that were used to revise the maps. I have here some printouts of our recommendation in Spanish, in French, and in Portuguese. So, Cassiano, you can take some with you. Just for you to see the kind of principle that we are using in the OECD work. So this was the group, and the group met like 8 times or 9 times over these 2 years, yeah, maybe. And then we did, you have here the milestones of the revision process. So we started in June 2015, although the process was launched in the spring. And 1 year after, we had the first draft. So in July 2016, we had the first draft of the maps, and we submitted it to public consultation. We tried it to be as comprehensive and as broad as possible. I don't know, maybe some of you missed the public consultation, but we published the maps in many different languages to try to reach out to as much targets as possible. So we had it in Russian, in French, in Spanish, in English, of course, and in Serbian and in Arabic. We missed the Portuguese maps for the moment, but we plan to have it as well. So we published all these different versions of the maps, and we collected a lot of feedback from the consultation. And then we did a first, let's say, public event about the new maps in Senegal last year, 1 year ago, in November 2016. And we ran this big conference to explain the new maps to people and to start also the testing exercise in Senegal. The way we did it, so we mapped what was around public procurement. We collected a lot of information. We designed the indicators. We came up with a version of the maps for public consultation. We received feedback from the public consultation, and at the same time, we started the testings of the maps in 3 selected countries from different regions and different income levels. So we used Norway, Senegal, and Chile for the testing. And also because of the testing, we collected lessons from the testing exercises, and we included them in the new maps. So it was kind of, let's say, a process that was self-feed by the work we were doing, with a lot of analytical work, collecting the past experiences, expectations, mapping the initiatives, and so on. And the main principles of the maps are the value for money, transparency, fairness, and good governance. Those principles were agreed by the working group from the beginning. It took some discussion to agree on them, in fact, but we managed to agree on these because we are coming from different backgrounds, we have different expectations, different objectives, different agendas. So we had to come up with considerations that made sense for everybody and to ensure that the maps would contribute to achieve effectiveness. That's what we pretend with what we intend with the new maps. So we came up with these maps from the consultation. We did the testing. We revised the maps following the testing exercises that were done beginning of this year and up until the mid this year. And then in September, we had another meeting, a final meeting to finalize the revised maps. And we presented it to the OECD countries in October, last October. And now we already have the Spanish version. It's done. We have also in the folder, yeah. So you have already the Spanish version of the maps. We have already the version of the maps in Russian, and we are working on the French version and the other languages as well to make it as broad as possible. And we plan to have a big event spring next year to launch the new maps. At the same time, we are working on the modules. We will have a session, and later in this session, Lina will talk about the modules. But we are working on the modules at the same time. So all good so far, right? So the maps is universal, it's harmonized, and it's a reform tool. These are maybe, let's say, the three main features of the new maps. We plan it to be used in all countries, regardless of the income level. And that's something that we managed to see when we did the testing in Norway and Chile and Senegal, that it was possible to use these maps to assess a procurement system in a country regardless of the income level. And because of that, we included the country context, the political environment, political economy. You will see the sections of the maps in the next slide that are addressing these topics. And it's also a tool that is mutually reliable. It's a new feature of the maps as well. That's something that the partners rely on. Because the previous maps were done individually by, let's say, the IDB, the World Bank, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and then the other partner would not recognize the assessment done by the others. And that's something, because now we have this group that includes everybody, and we believe these new maps is coming off a consensus, so it's mutually reliable. So if in Suriname, for instance, the Caribbean Development Bank is responsible with the country to conduct an assessment, the results of this assessment, if they follow the process we designed and the quality assurance mechanisms we embedded in the new maps, the results of this assessment would be recognized by the Inter-American Development Bank or the World Bank. That will reduce the burden of the assessments. That will also increase, let's say, the recognition of the maps and the quality of the new maps. And that is another objective that we have for these new maps. And it's also a reform tool. So it's a tool to help systems improve. And we did that in Norway. And you can imagine that the Norwegian system is already, let's say, a developed system and with a lot of very good features. But using the maps, we managed to understand some, let's say, areas for improvement, some gaps, and we provided recommendations to the country that they are now going to include it in the white paper they are submitting to the parliament every 10 years. They do this kind of exercise validating the procurement system, so providing feedback on the performance of the procurement system, and they are using the new maps to give them input to the white paper for the parliament to see what is happening in the procurement system in Norway. The same happened in Chile, and the same happened in Senegal. So the Chilean assessment also provided some good recommendations for the country to improve the procurement system. So that's something that is also relevant, and it also brings together the stakeholders. So when you do the MAPS assessment, you summon all the different stakeholders to the table, and you manage to talk to civil society, to the unions, to all the different stakeholders, the monitoring, the oversight, the key actors like the central purchasing bodies, the policymakers, and so on. And using the maps, you manage to have them around the table. So the maps encourage the dialogue in the country with a broad set of stakeholders. And that is something that sometimes is not happening because, as we all know, in many countries, we are having our daily jobs, and sometimes it's not easy to put together and to talk about openly and freely to talk about the procurement system. So we do believe that the new maps facilitates this coordination and is capable of bringing together, the key stakeholders of a procurement system. Any question? No? Okay. Good. So this is the analytical framework of the maps. You saw it in the maps itself. There is also this printout, this representation is there. And we are going to go in detail into each of the pillars. We have overall 4 pillars, 14 indicators, 55 sub-indicators. And the indicators are expressed either in qualitative and quantitative terms, following different assessment criteria. 2 new features of these maps is the analysis of the country context and also the supplementary modules. Because we wanted these maps to be universal and to be applied to all countries, regardless of these of the income level of the specificities of each country, we decided to, let's say, include in the core maps the relevant indicators and sub-indicators that would be sufficient to assess a system. But at the same time, we recognize that some countries were more developed in some areas like, for instance, sustainability, electronic procurement, PPPs and concessions, professionalization, and so on. So we decided to create these supplementary modules to address specific topics of the procurement process that are covered in the core maps, but at the same time are analyzed in deeper detail in these supplementary modules. Okay? So the core maps is sufficient to capture the essence of a procurement system, but at the same time, if a country wants to go deep in some areas, we design and we are finalizing the design of the supplementary modules to for the country to be able to go deeper in a specific area. For instance, one of the topics that is under design is the e-procurement. Because we know that countries are dealing with e-procurement in different ways. So we have a set of a couple of indicators in the core maps to address e-procurement. And it's enough, to have a snapshot and assessment of the situation. But then if you want to go really deep into the e-procurement analysis, you have the supplementary module. It's the way the maps was designed in order to be universal and to be able to be harmonized and used across all countries. Is that clear? Roberto, if you want to say something, feel free to jump in. It's not, just me talking, so I appreciate someone else talking as well.
De pronto,
Micro.
no, súper rápido.
No, volviendo atrás, el proceso de elaboración de la nueva metodología, como decía Paulo, fue un ejercicio participativo y de parte de Latinoamérica. Contamos con la representación de países que acompañaron los procesos, que revisaron las versiones, que aseguraron que fuera universal, que la forma de hacer contratación pública en Latinoamérica, independientemente de cómo ocurre en diferentes países, se viera reflejada también en los indicadores. Acompañaron Jamaica, Chile, Colombia, tanto dentro de las reuniones presenciales como también virtualmente y nutrieron el ejercicio de esa visión para que pueda aplicarse acá y también pueda aplicarse en otros países.
Yeah, and also the Caribbean Development Bank was part of the working group, and of course the IDB and the World Bank. So the multi-development banks in the region also played a very important role.
También, ¿por qué la importancia del trabajo conjunto entre los organismos multilaterales y financiadores? Porque lo explicaba Pablo y con Latinoamérica es un caso bastante marcado. Es que si un organismo multilateral acompaña un MAPS en algún país y si otro multilateral también reconoce ese resultado, el efecto, ¿tienen ustedes idea cuál es el efecto que se genera? Financiamiento. Si el BID hace un MAPS en Surinam y el Banco Mundial quiere tener alguna participación con alguna operación, el Banco Mundial o el Banco del Caribe no tiene que hacer otro diagnóstico y puede tomar decisiones de financiamiento o de cofinanciamiento. Entonces, es un elemento bastante poderoso.
Yeah. Okay. We are going to go in detail into the pillars and the modules, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time around it now. Lina will take care of that in a while. I just wanted maybe to highlight something that it was not mentioned before. We believe the MAPS is good to be used at the subnational level too. We know that and we understand that some regions, some cities are bigger than many countries. If you think about some Mexican states, they are bigger than many European countries. If you think about some federal states in Brazil, they are bigger than countries in Latin America as well. So we designed the maps in a way that it can be applied to countries, nations, so regions and cities. We know that, for instance, London, New York, Chicago, they are really big in terms of their procurement system, and we think that the MAPS is capable of assess the situation in these regions. So we know that cities are playing a very important role in terms of advancing the procurement agenda, namely the strategic procurement agenda, and we hope that in the future, in the near future, we'll be able to use the MAPS in regions and in states. So that's something also important for the big countries here. Argentina also the same situation. So I think that the MAPS is possible to be used in regions of Argentina or Germany, a federal state, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and so on. The US even, if they are open to this kind of analysis. Okay, so sorry, I already moved on to pillar 1. So sections 1 and 2, the user's guide and the country context. So these are the sections that are going to give you an idea how to conduct the assessment. So the user's guide is precisely what it is. It's the guide to help the users using the maps, how to conduct the assessment, the planning, the data collection, the analysis. We have some ideas and some templates around the recommendations, the structure for the report as well, the validation process. But we think that it should be customized to the country. So in spite of having like a series of templates that you can use to design the MAPS assessment, we believe that this assessment process should be customized to the country and to the reality of the country. And that's also the reason to have the country context in these maps. So the country context pays a very special attention to the stakeholders, to the political, economic, geostrategic situation of the country. So it's a section that is intended to give you an overview of the country, of how the country is doing, the procurement system in the country, but in general, and the connections between the procurement system, the budgeting, the planning, the other public finance management systems, and so on. So when the reader reads the country context, he gets an idea of the situation in a country, which is relevant also to link procurement to let's say, the broader public governance reforms. Because we know that procurement should not be seen in isolation, that should be seen in relation to the other reforms happening in the country, like you mentioned before. Some differences in the new maps regarding the previous one. We dropped the scoring system. There is no more scoring in the new maps. For those of you familiar with the previous maps, there is no ranking anymore, no 1, 2, or 3 scoring. The idea was that countries were paying too much attention about the result of the scoring and not about the content of each indicator, and not about the situation, or not about the assessment in itself, but should I get a 2 or 3? So, and because of that, we removed, and instead of that, we are doing the 3 steps approach, which means we review the system applying assessment criteria expressed in qualitative terms. We also review the system applying assessment criteria expressed in quantitative terms when possible. And then we analyze and we see if there are substantive or material gaps in the system, in the areas we analyze. So the maps provides a gap analysis. And when we identify serious breach or serious gaps, we issue a red flag. That is the process of the new maps. Okay? It's red flag based, and it's gap analysis based. It's not based on scoring. It might create some confusion at the beginning in terms of comparison, in terms of benchmarking, but it's also a reform tool. It's also something that you are going to use in the country, and not something that Suriname is better than Guyana, or Argentina is doing better than Brazil. This is not football, so we need to make sure that the assessment is targeted to the country, and we are doing what it needs to be done in the country to improve the procurement system and to design if possible. The idea is to have a strategic planning approach to the maps. The idea is the maps to be able to come up with a strategy to improve the procurement system and linking it to the other reforms, as I mentioned. So in the end of the maps process, you can end the maps process just with the assessment and the gap analysis, but it would be ideal to have some sort of action plan to overcome the gaps that were identified, agreed with all stakeholders, and then you can have something to monitor the evolution of the system in the future. Is that clear? No questions about it? So the maps, is intended to create some sort of baseline measurement, and then you can improve from the maps on. Micro. There is a question over there. No? Okay.
Probablemente de los temas más difíciles fue el que Pablo acaba de mencionar sobre dejar de usar la puntuación. Nos interesa conocer sus reacciones. ¿Cómo les parece? Quienes han aplicado MAPS, por ejemplo, en Paraguay, próximo va a ser sin números.
Eso fue un tema que nosotros justamente al analizar habíamos dicho que son cuestiones, o sea, los indicadores van a ser muy, ¿cómo diría? Porque, o es sí o no, no hay un intermedio. Entonces ahí es donde nosotros entrábamos, cómo íbamos a hacer esa evaluación, ¿verdad? Ya que lo otro, al tener puntaje, tenías parámetros para cada puntaje, ¿cierto? Y ahora para levantar esa bandera roja, no sé cómo lo haríamos, ya que son bastante radicales, ahí está la palabra, para tomar o no la bandera roja, ¿verdad?
Yeah, but until you reach the red flag, there are some steps, and we created like a sort of color mechanism. So you can use green, yellow, and red to show what is happening in a specific indicator. And the assessment criteria is really detailed. We are using quantitative indicators much more than before, and quantitative assessment criteria. And when possible, and if it's not possible, it's not just a yes or no. It's some sort of analysis, a gap analysis. So you have like a column to see, and you don't need to reach the red flag. It can be before that, just explaining the situation, identifying some material gaps, substantive gaps, and then you can decide using the color, yellow or.
We have the Norway version. Maybe we show this
Yeah, we can show it. Yeah. Yeah, but hold on.
¿Alguna otra, Gabriela?
Yo solo tenía una duda. La bandera roja significa pasó.
No.
O sea, es que, ok, por eso es que estaban hablando de que hay bandera amarilla y bandera verde. No,
See, well, yes.
más o menos. O sea,
Sí.
vamos como que fuera un semáforo normal, digámoslo así.
Yeah, see, the red flags
Okay.
means that there is a serious problem that was identified during the assessment and that you need to overcome. And then you need to design something to, a strategy to overcome the red flag. So for us, bandera roja, red flag is something that is not working well. Okay? For instance, this was the result of the assessment in Norway. We used you will see in the exercises, they were really creative. They created imaginary countries, Comprador and Contrataguay. So, very funny names. And they used, from the pilot exercises, they use examples from the different countries to come up with the ideas, and tasks for you. So this is the result of the Norwegian assessment. You see the situation, and it's easy. Just with one image, you can see where are let's say, the areas for improvement and the things that are not working so well. I can guarantee that we had some discussions with Norway about it, especially on the indicator 7 and 9, that they were not, maybe it's not all yellow, we have some green areas around it. And in fact, they do. They have green areas. But, if everything was green, then what was, the funny part of it? So, and we did identify some areas for improvement in these two indicators. So we presented it like this in the validation workshop. Tomorrow we will talk about the process, but there is a validation workshop with the key stakeholders, and where we explain the results of the assessment, and we show them what we plan to do and the recommendations we are giving in each of the indicators. So that's the idea. I think it's more, let's say, it's more consensual and it's more collaborative than the previous maps. It's not something that you go to the country and say, you are scoring 2, you are not good. Or you are 3, you are very good. But we know that the 3 doesn't mean the country is good. Some countries in the region, they got a good scoring in the previous maps, and we know the countries are not performing that well. Come on. So that was the idea of moving away from the scoring. Gabriel.
Sí.
You did Chile, so.
Claro, y justamente quería comentar mi experiencia de haber hecho evaluaciones MAPS con la metodología anterior y con la nueva. Y la nueva es realmente mucho más flexible. En la anterior se generaban discusiones larguísimas sobre por qué 1 o por qué 2, y si cumplía con este criterio y no con el otro. Era bastante más rígida, y esta versión es mucho más flexible y permite concentrarse en la esencia del problema, digamos, y no en un número de un puntaje, ¿no?
Eso es. We saw from the testing that this methodology was much easier to be accepted by the country than before, because the countries recognize the problems. They don't like the scoring, but they recognize where there are areas for improvement. So in different countries, we came up with this assessment, and we believe this approach is better for using the maps as a reform tool. Carlos, yeah.
Sí, y creo que también había una dificultad con la calificación anterior, sobre todo cuando las escalas, hay un problema cuando las escalas no son equivalentes. ¿A qué me refiero? Cuando un 3 no equivale a 3 veces 1. ¿Sí me explico? Entonces, las personas tenían mucho incentivo a sacar 3, pero porque entendían que eso era como sacar 3 veces 1. En realidad no había una distancia equivalente entre el 1 y el 2, entonces el 3.
Oh, that was tough.
Ya con eso ya.
So,
No, yo diría que el cambio importante que con todos los maps de 10 años anteriores era la dictadura de la metodología. O sea, lo importante era que los hechos se acomodaran a lo que el subindicador reflejaba. Si no funcionaba, había un gran problema. Lo que ahora la flexibilidad de esta metodología tiene es que lo que importa es cómo el país entiende el estándar y que pueda formular el argumento y sustentar y responder cómo se siente frente a ese estándar.
So the idea is to have a buy-in, a better buy-in from the country. Is it on? Yeah. No? So the idea is to have a buy-in from the country, to involve the stakeholders and to come up with something that is meaningful for the country in terms of achieving effectiveness, in terms of using the maps. That is the main purpose. And to do that, we are planning to create a map secretariat that is going to be hosted by the OECD. It was agreed by the working group that the OECD should have this role of hosting an independent secretariat. It's not an OECD structure, it's something independent, like the PIFA or the TADAT. They are hosted by different organizations. These secretariats, the idea is to help implementing the maps. So to start to have, let's say, a certification process for the assessors, to have a training materials for people to understand what is a MAPS assessment, things like we are doing here. And the idea is for the MAP Secretariat to run this kind of training and also to be responsible for the quality assurance. So we design the assessment process. We have from the planning until the execution. We have a certain milestones and steps that we need to undertake with terms of reference, carefully designed planning, involvement of stakeholders, validation process. We are going to talk about it tomorrow in the last session. But the idea of the secretariat is to be the repository of the assessments under the new maps. So something that we can share with the others. If someone wants to know an assessment and the assessment is made public and it's being held by the map secretariat, we can share the assessment of a given country or a system with other actors that are interested in this country. So this is the process around the secretariat. We are in the process of setting it up. Hopefully during the next year it will be already in place, and we will have this quality assurance mechanism, because for the testings we used the peer review process. We involved some members of the working group to go there and to be able to follow the process, to see if the assessment was being done using the quality assurance mechanisms we were creating. So, for instance, in Norway, we involved someone from Germany. In Chile, IDB asked OECD to play this role. In Senegal, it was the African Development Bank. So we had this kind of, let's say, cross-cutting experiences and participation. And that was something that helped us also understanding the lessons from the assessments. Now I pass the floor to Lina to go through the pillars quickly.
Okay. So now we're basically getting to the meat of the methodology. So you all have the methodology, and this is now going through the different indicators. But before we start, maybe just to check whether you have any more questions on what we discussed so far. No? All good. Okay, so let's start with pillar 1. Just to say, closer? Okay. So we have 4 pillars, looking at the main structures or things in the public procurement system. The first one are the rules. The second one are the institutions, so who's doing the public procurements or regulating the public procurement. The third one is looking at how it actually works, not only what the rules say you should be doing, but whether it's actually done. And the fourth one looks at accountability and transparency, so factors that really ensure that public procurement delivers best for the citizens. So pillar 1 is about the legal, regulatory, and policy framework. And it has 3 indicators. Just to explain you a little bit what we did in this table, here you have the title, what the indicator is about, and then we transformed this in a question, basically a question that this indicator tries to answer. It's always in the first line, and then a few bullets on what is contained in this indicator. If you are familiar with the old maps, you will see that actually this first pillar changed quite a bit, especially the first indicator was updated to match the current best practices on what should be covered by a good public procurement system or the good public procurement rules. What we put here are just a few examples. The indicator 1 contains rules, is about the rules of the entire public procurement systems, basically asking, are laws and regulations covering all aspects of the public procurement system? Part of this is e-procurement and data management, and then also public procurement principles, and then different aspects like even the control and audit framework should have a representation in the law, specifically to public procurement. Indicator 2 more or less stays the same. So while indicator 1 looks at the legal text and the regulatory text, indicator 2 is really about how this is then transformed into practice. So now I made a mistake. Number 1 is about the laws. Number 2 is about the regulations, tools, guidance, everything that helps transform the law into practice. So asking, how are the laws translated into practice? And then the third one is about secondary policy objectives and international obligations. And this is something that is quite new in the new maps. Before we didn't have this indicator 3. And here we're covering actually aspects of sustainability, like you mentioned. So this is an indicator that might be quite relevant in this context. So 1 is sustainable public procurement, just to make sure that the legal framework in the country allows for using sustainability criteria when conducting public procurement, to make sure there is sufficient space and no restrictions in the legal framework so that these criteria cannot be observed. And this is also a link to the supplementary module on sustainable public procurement. We'll talk about that later. Then the last part of this indicator 3 is around obligations deriving from international agreements. So this is, for example, about the WTO government procurement agreements, the GPAs. Of course, if a country signs up to such an international agreement, then it should also be reflected in the national laws. And this indicator is there to make sure that there is a consistency between whatever international agreements, also trade agreements, a country enters into, and what the public procurement system asks to be done. So these are the first 3 indicators, the first pillar. Let's maybe stop there and take a moment to see whether you have questions, whether everything is clear. The pillar 2 is called institutional framework and management capacity. Here we have 5 indicators, all evolving around the institutions that are there to conduct public procurement. Indicator 4 is about the links between the public procurement system and the public financial management system and the budget. The simple idea being that if you don't have a budget, you shouldn't be doing public procurement, or you need to ensure that whatever you're doing on the purchasing side is also well reflected on the budget side. And this is what indicator 4 does. It has been more or less the same between the previous version of the maps and the current version, just updated to today's realities, basically. Indicator number 5 is about the institution in charge of the normative and regulatory function. So basically the public procurement institutions such as Colombia Compra Eficiente, just because we're here, but also many of you are coming basically from the institution that is covered in this indicator 5. Here the idea is to see how is the public procurement regulator structured? Is it structured in a way that it can fulfill its responsibilities in an efficient way? And so what we want to see there is that all the functions are assigned without gaps, but also without overlaps. You know, it needs to be one institution in charge and not 2 or 3 for the same thing, so that there are conflicts. Then the authority of this institution needs to match whatever the responsibilities are. Also the funding, the staffing. Basically, you need to have enough resources to do your job well. And then one aspect there is also that this institution is supposed to be free from conflict of interest. That is, on the one hand, something you can see in the institutional structures, but also in the sense of the conflict of interest in the sense of corruption, for example. So indicator 6, now we're going one level down. The contracting authorities, the units that are conducting the procurement day to day. They are the topic in indicator 6. And again, we're asking the question, how are these units structured? Does it work well, the structure, or are there maybe deficits? Again, these units have to be clearly defined. It has to be clear what their responsibilities are. How the authority is delegated from the upper levels down the hierarchy. And then one particular aspect that is covered in one sub-indicator is about centralized purchasing. So whether there has been an analysis of whether it would make sense to centralize purchases and create maybe a centralized purchasing body. And that would then be covered in a sub-indicator.
Just a comment on this one, you know that, let's say 33 out of 35 OECD countries, they have a centralized purchasing body. We see this trend in many countries around the world. So we designed this indicator precisely to capture these new tendencies about, you know, centralization, collaborative procurement, joint procurement. Agencies like Colombia Compra Eficiente or some of the, like Peru Compras or others, yeah.
Okay. Okay, indicator 7. Yes.
It's a new one.
De lo que he leído de la metodología, veo que se recomienda que se tenga un cuerpo central de contratación, pero ahí yo creo que es importante que se evalúe qué tan costoso podría representar esto, por ejemplo, sobre todo en los países que son grandes, que a lo mejor ya a la hora de distribuir los bienes o servicios como papel, lápices, que es que todas las dependencias utilizan, pudiera resultar más caro que si cada una los contrata de manera individual. Y además otras responsabilidades que surgen, por ejemplo, en México, cuando las contrataciones son muy grandes, se pide la participación de un testigo social, pero ese testigo social genera un costo porque se le debe de pagar por hacer ese trabajo de vigilancia y a lo mejor también encarecería más la contratación.
Yeah, it depends on the country, you know, it's not something that, of course, we think it's a good solution, but it depends on the way the country is organized. And we look at the organization in the country, and we are not saying it's a bad organization because you don't have a central purchasing body. We are not saying that. We are just we are trying to identify if there are opportunities to use centralization and joint procurement. For instance, in Mexico, you know very well, IMSS is doing joint procurement and, you know, these compras consolidadas. They do it, and they have huge benefits because they aggregate the demands and the needs from different purchases in the health system. So there are different mechanisms that we can look at in the country.
Con esto que usted responde, me responde a la pregunta, porque es que yo tenía la duda porque, o sea, si es un indicador que va a marcar una banderita, digámoslo así, creo que muchos nos vamos a ir quedando, porque, por ejemplo, nosotros en Guatemala no tenemos centralizadas las compras más que el convenio marco o el contrato abierto que nosotros llamamos, pero por ahí, o sea, sí podría ser algo. Por ejemplo, nosotros en PEFA nos baja mucho la calificación en no tener un órgano independiente para los recursos, y eso nos tira y a nosotros nos tira el punteo, porque obviamente no lo promedian, pero no lo tenemos ni nuestra ley no lo permite. En este caso es lo mismo, o sea, hay una ley de presupuesto que no nos permitiría tener centralizadas todas las compras, a menos que cambiemos una y más leyes, ¿verdad? Entonces, solo para saber si el indicador, digámoslo así, nos va a calificar en rojo o si permite tener una flexibilidad ahí para poder pues optar a un mejor indicador, a una mejor nota.
You want to say something? Yeah, and then yeah, go
ahead. Sobre el diseño institucional y organizacional de los entes rectores. Creo que... ¿Así? Sí, no sé. Personal. ¿No? ¿Quién está controlando el sonido? Vamos a parar más bien, perdón. Si no mucho eco, perdón. Sobre el diseño institucional y organizacional de los entes rectores, nosotros, pues, como consultor del BID, hemos hecho un trabajo de una guía metodológica para diseñar entes rectores en la región. Y lo que nos hemos dado cuenta, Ana Cristina y Leslie me complementan, es, en realidad, como dice Paulo, depende del país. Entonces no hay una receta única para todos los países. En algunos casos sí es del nivel de coordinación. Vamos, la agregación, la coordinación es la palabra clave, no la agregación de la demanda para comprar en un solo sitio. En otros casos sí es conveniente reunir en un solo sitio las compras, pero en realidad lo primero es entender el contexto local y las condiciones de las compras de cada uno. Sí existen ventajas para crear entes rectores y creo que a veces la confusión se da en ese gran nombre de ente rector o gran que se aplica en diversos países para diversas soluciones. Entonces sí existe un mecanismo para definir y yo creo que hay un punto clave en eso, es que la entidad que se diseñe o se rediseñe siga la estrategia que se definió. Que ahí es donde muchas veces tenemos el problema, es entidades que están desalineadas con la estrategia. Entonces, el diseño en realidad depende de la estrategia del país y del entorno. Entonces, la estructura organizacional que definamos debe seguir la estrategia y el entorno de cada país.
Pero las leyes fueron hechas para se cambiar, entonces se puede cambiar la ley, ¿no? Si al final de la evaluación se mira que es mejor cambiar, ¿por qué no se cambie? Entonces una recomendación podría ser cambiar la ley para que se pueda hacer centralización de compras.
Sí, y recuerden que Paulo y Lena han venido haciendo énfasis en un par de cosas nuevas que ayudan a que ese problema que Gabriela plantea salga adelante y se maneje de una forma aceptable. Primero es que hay sección de contexto de país, donde yo cuento quién soy y al contar quién soy y cómo funciona, yo puedo explicar por qué ciertos indicadores tienen alguna razón de presentarse de cierta forma. Y segundo es quitarnos los puntajes y poder explicar en cada problema si eso realmente es un problema para el país y si realmente él va a querer levantar la bandera. Eso es flexible. Y el país que se tome tiene el poder de determinar, porque es que la herramienta es para que le sirva al país. Yeah.
There was one question from there. Yeah, please go ahead.
I hope I can articulate this the way how it's going through my head, because so many things are going through my head just now.
Okay, good.
So MAPS, in its basic form, will assess a country purchasing system against best practices. So if, let's say we have a scenario whereby there is a particular country who has a highly bureaucratic system, it has its own procurement purchasing legislation. And yes, whilst it is very bureaucratic, it executes its purchases in accordance with that piece of guiding legislation. You do an assessment. That model may not be the best when stacked up against international best practices. The end result of that assessment is that we're saying, yes, you have conducted your affairs in accordance with your legislation. However, it's not in alignment with international best practices. where is the gap in that? How would you objectively look at the system with that kind of scenario?
Well, a procurement system is a system that works, right? A good procurement system. That's the first part of the reply. I would say the MAPS is aspirational in itself. It's not just about bringing good practices, it's about setting up the standard a bit higher than before. So we will say that, you know, the country is doing well, it's performing, but there are some areas where you can improve. You can reduce bureaucracy, you can do this, you can do that. It will come up like that, hopefully.
Yeah, and actually, I think that this point is also very relevant for the Pillar 3. I mean, now we're looking at the institutions, but the actual performance is a topic in Pillar 3. So I think it's very well balanced and actually possible to say, look, your law is actually not what international best practice recommends or what many countries find useful. However, we see that your performance is good, could be. And in Norway, actually, we saw a situation where we would have maybe expected more stringent rules, for example, but because Norway works as a very trust-based system, we saw that they were able to deliver even though it wasn't really clear on what basis, because small things were different than in other countries. So I think what Roberto mentioned before, that we now don't have this stringent system of rating, but rather a system where you describe your findings, your analysis and your conclusion, and also the reason why you assign a red flag or not, provides a lot of space to really take into account the individual country and its way of working, and to see whether it delivers or not. That's the point.
And let me say something. We've been, we start just and then we move ahead. So last comment is, we've been checking how the three countries were assessed in the pilots: Norway, Senegal, and Chile. And despite we checked the arguments and all the text, you could even maybe arrive to a conclusion that a gap was there, or the opposite. Yeah, there's no gap. But it's really the country who had the last word. So, and he had the interpretation of the facts and his own needs. So it's he is the owner of the conclusion.
Un comentario que quería hacer al respecto del indicador 5, que es un cambio importante que veo en la metodología entre la versión anterior y la nueva, es que en la anterior hacía énfasis en la institución rectora, o el ente rector o regulador, y ahora se hace énfasis en la función reguladora. Y en los países, como se mencionó acá, puede estar, esa función reguladora puede estar ubicada no en una sola institución, sino en varias, y lo importante que trata de evaluar el MAPS en esta nueva versión es si todos los aspectos de la función reguladora están bien definidos, bien asignados y bien coordinados, y que no existan superposiciones o áreas que no cubre nadie, ¿no?
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point, that the way the indicator is worded, it allows you to take into account different scenarios in different countries. And we try to do that not just for indicator 5, but throughout the indicator system, taking just in mind that, keeping in mind that we have different ways of solving the same problem. So let's look at the last two indicators. So this was all about institutions and so on. Now we're looking at the information systems. So everything that has to do with e-procurement, for example. The fact that it's easier to manage public procurement using information technology, and then what you do with the information that you gather. So this indicator looks at the extent to which e-procurement is actually implemented and used, what the strategic plans are behind the e-procurement system. It provides a link to the supplementary module on e-procurement. So if countries want to take a deep dive on the topic of e-procurement, that will be possible as well. We're currently developing that. And then one aspect that is also in this indicator is the topic of open contracting. So to what extent is the data that is created in the public procurement system also available and accessible for either the general public, but also stored in a format that it's searchable and can be analyzed in the future or for the future to steer the public procurement system. Indicator 8 is a bundle of two different concepts. Indicator 8 is looking at how the system learns. So looking at how fast public procurement has changed, this indicator takes into account that the public procurement system shouldn't be static. It should be developing to keep up with the challenges that emerge. And for that, you need two different aspects. One is the public procurement workforce need to be trained and need to be able to keep up. One sub-indicator is also asking to what extent public procurement is considered a profession. And then another one is about performance management and monitoring of the public procurement system. So is there a system in place to allow for this performance monitoring? Is the data available? And are there targets available, for example? Yeah. Here we have a link to the supplementary module on professionalization. So this is just the overview, the surface, and then the supplementary module, we'll talk about that later, can provide a deep dive. So before we switch to the next pillar, any more questions on those last two indicators?
These are new indicators. So these indicators are new, and they try to capture two main features, e-procurement and professionalization and training, and the capacity to evolve from within. So the capacity of a system to improve and to evolve.
Of data security?
It's part of the e-procurement. It's part of the e-procurement indicator.
Yes. It's I didn't mention it, but it's one of the assessment criteria in indicator 7. Now don't ask me which one, but it's there.
No, but it's there. It's there, of course. Yeah. Okay,
pillar 3. You remember pillar 1 was all about the rules. Pillar 2 was all about the institution. So what is missing is the performance, how it actually works. So this is now a little bit related to your question, maybe. And now the new feature in this pillar that is important and that hasn't been there in the new maps are quantitative indicator. Before there was a system of baseline indicators and for a certain period of time in the maps methodology. Now the concept is that we have qualitative indicators and then we have certain mandatory quantitative indicators where the idea is that you look at the data that we just talked about that is produced in the system and track certain very hard performance criteria. And most of them you find in indicator 9, which makes sense because the idea is that these quantitative indicators tell you very well how the system performs in practice. One other aspect in this indicator is that the idea should be to analyze a set of sample cases. So you actually take out a few of the procurement processes and go through them and analyze how they were done and whether they actually were done in a good way. The focus of this indicators is about the results. I already mentioned it, but specifically those that have a development impact. So value for money, improved service delivery, also trust in government, and then secondary policy objectives. Here's a link also to the supplementary module on agency assessment, simply because that is where you would find the day-to-day performance of the public procurement system. Indicator 10 is about the public procurement market. So here we are looking about the interaction with the suppliers or with the private sector and how well that is organized. It's about the dialogue and partnerships between the public sphere and the private sphere, whether it's organized with integrity, whether there is a good exchange, whether the private sector is actually able to deliver on the needs of the government. And one other aspect is key sectors that are maybe especially important in the country, and whether there are specific strategies or even risks related to these sectors. Okay.
This one was very interesting to do in the country context, like for instance Norway, where there is a strong culture of collaboration between the public and the private, and the participation of the private sector in the designing of the laws and the legal process and all of that. It was something that came naturally from this indicator. And of course the countries are different, but we believe this indicator is a good one to capture this relationship.
Do you have any questions?
Bueno, estou a ver no subindicador número 10C. Não vi no indicador nada específico sobre PYMEs. Há uma rápida remissão a mercados específicos. Me pergunta, no caso de se implementar a metodologia MAPS em países como nossos, todos somos, em que se há como posso dizer em espanhol, uma preocupação muito grande com as pequenas e médias empresas, não tem, me pareceu um pouco estranho não ter um indicador específico para PYMEs. É possível rever para que isso componha a metodologia? Isso seria muito importante para o Brasil, na medida em que estamos fomentando a participação das PYMEs em compras públicas. E me parece que se tem este indicador de metodologia, temos mais possibilidade de sua aplicação.
It's a very good question. The fact is that we took care of it in the Pillar 1 because it's part of the legal framework. If you support small and medium enterprises using the procurement system, then it should be reflected in the legal framework, and then we will see if the institutions are capable of following it through. This indicator is more for, like, let's say, sectors like defense, energy, transport, education, key sectors that the countries, if the country has specific procurement strategies for each of these specific sectors, else, and so on. So, yeah.
Y yo, sabes que creo que sí vas a encontrar de varias maneras reflejada la necesidad de prestarle atención a las pequeñas y medianas empresas a través de varios indicadores, no necesariamente enfocados al tema. Se dice, bueno, esto también verifícalo en el ámbito de las micro y medianas empresas. Pero también hay uno particular, que es el 10B, donde presta atención, que es el 10B, es organización del sector privado y acceso al mercado de las contrataciones públicas, donde hay un énfasis particular a las MIPYMEs. Para mi gusto está incluido y siempre fue un tema de especial atención.
But we have a special indicator on this one, which is the 3A, which is the one that is looking at the way the country is using procurement to achieve other policy objectives. And it includes also, of course, as part of these policy objectives, sustainability, green procurement, social considerations, small and medium enterprises, and so on. So first you look at the legal framework, and then you see how it's applied in practice.
Yeah, I think the idea is to have
agnostic of,
so
because it needs to be applied to all countries. So
it needs to be applied to all countries, but also all kinds of situations of their private sector. And in Norway, for example, they have a very similar setup that it's SMEs that deliver a large part of the contracts, but also of the business in the economy. And it was very easy, actually, to include these considerations in the analysis. like in indicator 10, there's space, in indicator 3, and on different aspects. So one is support specifically for specific groups, can be SMEs, but it could also be women-owned enterprises. It could be the environment. It's one aspect that might be supported by public procurement, and there are different ways in the maps how this is reflected. And then if you're looking at the private sector specifically, it would be indicator 10 where you say the situation in Brazil and Norway is that the private sector is mostly consists mostly of SMEs. So that means for our analysis the following aspects. So I think it's very much there and can be applied.
Y una cosa más, esta metodología tiene algo que se mejora muchísimo al anterior, que es el glosario. Y dentro del glosario está objetivos complementarios de política y define. Y dentro de la definición claramente identifica pequeñas y medianas empresas.
Okay. Okay. Move on to pillar 4. Yeah.
So last pillar, pillar 4. Now we're looking at the accountability of the system and the integrity and also transparency. So all factors that ensure that the public procurement system works well. We have 4 indicators. Let's start with indicator 11, which is about transparency and civil society engagement. So asking the question, how is the public involved in public procurement? That has to do, on the one hand, with the legislative process of coming up with the laws and the rules, but also specifically about every single public procurement case and how the public, for example, the social witnesses, as were mentioned before, might have an influence on the decisions made in individual processes. So this is new because it really recognizes the role that civil society has in public procurement. That hasn't been that clear in the previous maps. There, it covers the preconditions for effective participation, such as programs to build capacity of stakeholders, but also the goals of making public procurement more competitive. Indicator 11, and especially 11A, is a little bit funny because it takes other sub-indicators throughout the methodology that are related to this aspect and takes them together and then asks the assessment team to take all of these into consideration and then make a conclusion based on that. So, for example, open data that we saw in indicator 7, but also aspects of the legal framework, whether the legal framework provides for the possibility to participate. Indicator 12 is about the control and audit system. And the idea here is to see whether, I mean, every country organizes it differently, but the idea is that there should be a control and audit system that efficient and effectively covers also the public procurement realm. This is to make sure that there are checks and balances for the procurement transactions and adequate feedback through this internal audit function. This indicator in particular has been aligned with the PIFA framework, so that is new, and it has been streamlined with when you compare it to the previous versions of the methodology. So indicator 13 is about the appeals mechanism and to see how well or not this aspect of the public procurement system is working. That indicator was there in the previous maps versions as well, but it has also been updated and streamlined and clearly structured in the different aspects. So the processes that are there, the independence of the appeals body, and the decision-making, whether it's consistent. And finally, indicator 4 is about the concrete ethics and anti-corruption measures with regards to public procurement, asking how the public procurement system safeguards integrity. It's a very long indicator. If you look at it, I think it goes up until sub-indicator F, so a lot of different aspects. And that tells you a little bit about how broad this indicator is and how broad the measures are that should be there to safeguard integrity. the sub-indicators range from legal definitions of sanctions, of wrongdoing, but also it's about education and awareness raising. And then we have several quantitative indicators that are recommended to substantiate the analysis there. So for example, looking at how many corruption cases with regards to public procurement were prosecuted and concluded in recent years. Any questions on these 4 indicators?
So to come back to your question, you know, in this indicator, one of these indicators is about the independent review process and the appeals mechanism. And in fact, it's one of the good practices we recommend. So it, in the case of Guatemala, would come up as in the PIF assessment that the fact that you don't have an independent body to take care of reviews and appeals, that would be considered not a good practice. And that's something that we would recommend to change the law to make it happen and so on. And so I don't know if it would be a red flag before the assessment. Maybe it's a yellow, depending on the structure and the way you are organized, or maybe it will be red. It depends on the assessment and the final result. But that is a major concern in terms of fairness and competition. Yes. Any other comment? So now we can break. Optional modules still.
Perdón que pregunte tanto. Pero tengo una duda. Por ejemplo, en este caso, nosotros cuando hicimos la evaluación PEFA, nos abocamos a que no teníamos un órgano independiente, pero existen otros órganos que se encargan de administrar si hay un proceso legal, digamos, un proceso administrativo antes de un proceso legal. Sí existe esa parte. Pero, por ejemplo, en este caso no fue tomado en cuenta porque ellos necesitan que tengamos un órgano independiente. Entonces fuimos calificados con 0. ¿verdad?
Perdón, te calificaste con 0. Me califiqué con 0.
Claro, pero es que porque yo hice todo el antecedente. O sea, nosotros sí pusimos todo ese antecedente de, no, o sea, existen los órganos los jurisdiccionales para dilucidar los conflictos, pero para ellos no valía eso. Entonces, no es flexible. Yo entiendo que aquí va a ser más flexible, según lo que dijeron desde el inicio. Pero porque sí tenemos quien haga esa función. No está dentro de nuestra, o sea, no es un órgano que funcione como paralelo a la dirección de contrataciones. Pero ellos eso es lo que querían, un órgano independiente. Entonces,
es más flexible, pero mucho más profundo. Vamos a mirar en profundidad, vamos a ver cómo se hace de manera concreta. Entonces, solo después de la evaluación.
Gracias.
Okay, so that would be it for the first session then. I hope you've understood how the maps works, and we'll see in practice later. And I guess it comes a little bit also when you're doing the exercises that you see how it works with the indicators.